Hello everybody, my name's Brenda Smith. I'm an assistant tutor at Nillumbik U3A, painting and drawing, and today I'm going to introduce you to watercolours. So if you'd like, come into my studio. Watercolour is a wonderful medium. It is, as it says, water with a pigment in it, and the whole process is not very messy, it's easy to take out, and of course it's fun to use. When you firstly put on a water layer onto your paper, choose a colour. Now the colour I'm going to choose today is going to be cerulean blue. And then we take our colour, you'll notice that it blends in nicely. We don't want to leave any straight lines, we want it all blended beautifully, because this is the first of our layers that we're going to do for cerulean. You'll notice I've already taped it down, and you'll notice that the paper is quite a thick paper, and the reason for that is because it's watercolour, it does absorb, and you really need to have at least 200 to 300 grams weight. Whilst this is drying on the cartridge paper, just a word about the paper. I have small pads here which I use. I also have larger ones, but they are, as I say, watercolour paper, and they're much heavier than normal sketching paper. The brushes are also different to the brushes you would use for acrylic. You're best to invest in one really nice brush, one good brush, which holds the water and has a point. To give you a demonstration of how these pointed brushes work for watercolour, if you've got a good point on it, you can actually get quite good lines with good control. But then you quite often want a broader sweep. So you take it into a broader sweep and a small one, and then into a broader sweep, and then out through the point. You can do this with any colour, and you finish up with quite a rope effect, but it shows you what your brush is capable of. What I've done is to make myself a card with all the colours that I own, with the name of it at the side of them, and so that if I want a dark red, I will know to go to alizarin. If I want an orangey red, I will know to go to crimson. When I'm out painting, I very rarely take the tubes. I take with me this little transportable watercolour set which stacks, and the stacks go in colours one on top of another, very easy to carry, as you can see. And on top of the stack comes a lid which can also double as your mixing tray. As we come to our second layer, which is the same colour but laying on top of the dried first grade, you will find that you get an intensity, which is what watercolour is all about. So see that, load up your brush, see that you have enough in, and this time we're only going to start part way down. And you do what you did before. You lay on a layer of cerulean blue. Cerulean is a warm blue. It's a warm blue because it has a little bit of yellow in it, and it's very suitable for skies and water in general. A cold blue would be cobalt blue, and cobalt blue is what you would use perhaps for a sea, where the sea is very cold, doesn't have any sunlight in it, and therefore is what we call a cold blue. So there is your second layer. You notice that I have 2 glasses of water. This one that I'm about to put the brush I've just finished with in is for cleaning the brushes, and it will change colour as we go along. This one is for adding the water to your colour, and that needs to be clean all the time. So when you take your brush, there we are. You'll notice that I also have a cloth, and this cloth is when you want to get rid of the excess from your brush, have the white cloth here ready. Intensifying colours means that you can go 4 times perhaps into real depth of colour. And this is really good when you're doing flowers, for instance. This iris has several layers of depth of colour. And this works really well and is the quality of watercolour. The same here applies to the rhododendrons I did. And you must start from light to dark. The light or the white must be left, because once you lose it, you will never retrieve it. So in other words, when you paint watercolour, always go from light and finally to dark. During the pandemic, watercolours are wonderful for making cards, for birthdays, sympathy cards, and I've done a lot of these, and it shows you the intensity of colour that you can get when you paint in watercolour. If you put layer upon layer, as we're doing with the cerulean, you find that you get that depth of colour. I've enjoyed doing those. I've done many. I've even done them for younger people. This is for a granddaughter, and this one here is for one of the guys. And you have lots of fun, and it does lend itself. And now we've had 3 layers have dried. I put in 3 layers, and I'm putting in the final layer of cerulean blue, which is exactly the same shade as the first one. Well, we're ready to begin our painting, which is going to be of a sunset. So you get your A4 paper cartridge and tape it down to avoid any buckling on 4 sides. And then with your clean water, simply wet across the cartilage, nice and smoothly across, because our first technique that we're going to learn is called wet on wet. And wet on wet means that your colours can merge into each other. You can also do a graded wash. And because we're doing a sky, that means we can go from the heavier blue above your head to the distant horizon where it's much, much paler. I've already wet the paper, which will make it wet. So now we're doing wet on wet. My cerulean sky is ready, and I'll begin. Now, as the sky proceeds to the horizon, it automatically becomes much paler. So I've got to be ready with the water and bring it down so it becomes a paler hue. And then, as the sun has set, the land part of the painting is going to be a pinky glow. And for this, I've used alizarin. Alizarin red is here. I have a quantity of it mixed up. And I shall begin moving that across the painting. Seeing to it that I blend, when we get to the blue, we blend the blue into the pink, into the rose alizarin. Because we're doing the sunset, we probably need a little bit of orange where the sun has disappeared. So I can include this wet on wet. I take a little cotton bud and I just lift a little bit of the paint, not too much, but this will be my moon. Whilst we're waiting for the first wash to dry, let me show you the sort of landscapes that are suitable for watercolour. Anything to do with water, of course. And this one here, if you were painting this is in Yorkshire, you would leave your white. Wherever there was white, you would leave that, and then you would superimpose different grades until it gets darker and darker for the rocks. Another water one would be reflections. And this one below is a street reflection, which of course, as you know, shimmers and shakes, and you can get a lovely pure colour and reflections on the street scene in the rain. first wet on wet has dried, and now we're ready to put on some wet on dry, and we're going to put in a shoreline and some of the distant hills. So the first thing we need to do is to get our shoreline, which will be pretty much like this. And then we'll start working in our hills from the back. You notice with watercolour that when it dries, it normally dries lighter than when you apply it. So when you're applying it, it looks quite a strong colour, but it does tend to lose some of those tones as it dries. And whilst it's still wet, we need to put one or two shadows in. And so we take our cerulean blue and just bring in a couple of shadows in the distant hills whilst it's still quite wet. And you'll find this will blend beautifully. I've mixed a little bit of cobalt blue in with the cerulean blue, and also a little bit of the orange to give the reflections of the sunset. And here we go. Let that dry, and then we'll go in and put the hills that are nearer to the shoreline, which of course will be darker. To do the foreground hills, we need to mix in the blue, a little bit of the orange. There we are. So we've got a stronger colour because none of the sunlight, of course, is reflected on these particular hills. So in we go. And now we're going to paint the mountains that are closest to the lake, and we'll find that these are the darkest of them all. Whilst we're waiting for the sunset to dry before we put on our next coat, looking here are two paintings which show you that watercolour is very good for atmosphere and delicacy. Now this top one is snow, and as you can see it's a winter day, and the snow of course is never white, it always has colour in it, but because you can use gentle colour it blends in very, very beautifully with the clouds. Below is one taken that I did at Buffalo, Mount Buffalo, and this shows hang gliders on the Buffalo Mountain taking off. And the secret of this one is that you absolutely must keep the hang glider white. Don't let any colour anywhere near it. And the same with the man's shirt and the lady's hair. And we do the same thing, put in your cerulean sky and then start building up your hills at the back. Very pale, becoming more and more green, and eventually finishing up in the valley near Bright with the grass in front of it. We can paint the birds flying in at sunset over the water. And here is your sunset over the water, birds flying in. hope you've enjoyed painting watercolour with me. I've enjoyed it too. Bye bye everybody from Eltham.